Have you ever made plans with someone? You made plans, you picked the date, you sent out the text message, hey, can we meet in this place? Can we go for coffee? Talk about the time, talk about the location. You throw all that stuff out there, but you get sort of this weak response back from them. Something like, yeah, I think I can make it, or yeah, I'll probably be there. Something like that. I've got a few friends who tend to respond this way. Now, me, in my kind of snarky way, I kind of want to respond back to them and say, well, if you figure at the last second, after you've weighed all your options, that you are going to actually bless me with your presence, I might show up. I don't say that, but I have in my younger and maybe less gracious years actually just scheduled with other people who would make a confirmation about whatever it was that we were trying to get together and do. But we all know that there's a big difference between a I might or I think and an I will. There's a big difference between those things. Now, of course, sometimes people break their commitments. I mean, I break my commitments at times. Things do happen, but at least a commitment has been made that we're going to do something or that we say that we're going to do something. But the difference between an I could kind of person and an I will person is tremendous. We know it's tremendous because we might like the first person. We may think, hey, they're fun to be around. But the fact is that we're probably not going to have a lot of faith in them. We're probably not going to really trust them to follow through because we've sort of learned from our past experience. But why should we trust them? Again, if that's sort of the track record that they've left for us. Well, many of us, when we think about God, we think about who God is and what his nature is, we sometimes think of God also as being sort of an I might or I could kind of God. A God who could possibly, but there's a good chance he won't. On one hand, we know that God has the power to follow through. We know he's got that power. But on the other hand, we're just not so sure that he is going to or wants to or is going to feel like interceding in the moment. And often when we pray, our prayers can kind of reflect this a little bit. We kind of hedge our prayer requests in such a way that we give God an out that we think he's probably going to end up taking. Now, when we have a friend who's not willing to commit to doing something, or it's just sort of a no-show or tends to flake out, it doesn't take too many of those situations before we start to alter our behavior. Maybe we stop scheduling with them. We definitely stop relying on them just because, again, this pattern that we have seen. But if we think about God this way, is that sort of that non-committal God who is probably not going to follow through, even though we are requesting that he do so. If we think about him that way, then that also is going to impact our faith in him as well, and the way that we interact with and seek after him. It's hard to have trust in or faith in a God who we think perhaps could deliver, but probably won't. But what if the problem isn't God? What if the problem isn't God? What if the problem is really that our perspective of God is skewed in some way? A perspective that if we alter our perspective and our understanding, that would not only transform our understanding of who God is, but it would actually change our relationship with him and our trust in him for the better. So today we are jumping back into Daniel in our Daniel sermon series. We're looking at chapter 3 today, and again, the entirety of this chapter. And as you already heard, this is a story that many of us are familiar with. Many of us grew up hearing different Bible stories, and this is one of them, often told and retold in children's storybooks about the Bible. But if you've not already done so, we're going to go through bits and pieces of the text. Please open your Bibles at this time to Daniel chapter 3 so you can follow along. Now, as we're getting into this chapter, it's important that we understand what just happened in the previous two chapters, and especially at the very end of chapter 2. Because in chapter 2, Daniel had these three companions that Sharon read about. And Daniel, along with these companions, they were in prayer that Nebuchadnezzar's dream would be revealed to them. Not only what the dream was, but the interpretation of the dream. And God had, of course, provided that interpretation. He provided it to Daniel. And Nebuchadnezzar responded to hearing what this interpretation of the dream was, which was a miraculous thing, by acknowledging that Daniel's God was the God above all gods, the revealer of mysteries. And then he promoted Daniel to this very high level of authority within the kingdom. And then at Daniel's request, in particular, if you look at Daniel 2, verse 49, Nebuchadnezzar appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to similar positions, not quite as high of a level of authority, but high levels of authority in the kingdom as well. Now in chapter 1, in Daniel chapter 1, we learn that God had given all of these men wisdom and learning and knowledge, well beyond that of their contemporaries. He blessed them in this way. And then at the end of chapter 2, these men now had been placed in levels of authority and power in the kingdom well beyond that of their contemporaries as well. And really, if you think about it, these men had really, this transformed their place in the kingdom. They had come in as slaves with nothing, and now they had all this wisdom, better wise men than any of the others in the kingdom, and they had this level of authority and power as these government leaders. So this brings us into chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar erected this image out of gold. And then in Daniel 3:2, we start to read about that. It says this: Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So with their new authority that these three men now had, they would have been included. They would have been among these officials that Nebuchadnezzar had asked to come to this sort of inauguration, this presentation of this image. Then looking at Daniel 3, jumping to verse 4. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." So this order that went out clearly was for everybody in the kingdom. Everybody was supposed to obey this order. But it was going to be particularly important for his officials, King Nebuchadnezzar's officials, to be following, because they were the key people in key places. And if they weren't following, then why would anybody else be following this order either? But this all really set these three men to be singled out by others who had malicious intentions, who wanted to see them brought down in some way. If we look at verse 12 in chapter 3, it says, "There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." And that was true. We already heard from the story. That was true. They weren't going to do that. They were not going to bow down before this image in any way. And there were many things that King Nebuchadnezzar probably found infuriating about this particular situation. And these are probably things that we would miss given our own cultural context. Because in our culture, we value things like religious freedom. We value that. So to us, it might make sense that there was this whole weird thing where they weren't going to follow through, and Nebuchadnezzar could have respected that. But in their culture, things were very different. And I think a better way of maybe thinking about this is imagine, for example, that a bunch of immigrants, come into the United States. They're coming into the United States. They're made U.S. citizens. They plug right on in. They're working hard. They're paying taxes, integrated into our culture. Some of them even become elected officials. Some of them become government workers. So they're doing what they need to do. They're doing a good job immigrating into the country and establishing a life here. Yet, as a group, none of these immigrants will ever say the Pledge of Allegiance. They refuse. And none of these immigrants will ever stand and sing the Star-Spangled Banner. They refuse to do that. Well, many Americans would find that kind of behavior to be extremely disrespectful. They would think that's very disrespectful. They would think maybe that they were being ungrateful, insubordinate if they're government workers and they refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And some might even think that, hey, if you're not going to do that, then you're not even worthy of being an American citizen. Now, this is probably more akin to why Nebuchadnezzar reacted the way he did, because within their cultural context, to bow down before an idol, to maybe even sacrifice to the idol, to worship in some way, was just sort of the cultural thing that you did. This was a way of showing respect to your host or the king or whatever. It didn't really matter if you didn't mean it. This is what you did. This was just sort of the common conventional courtesy. Again, somewhat on par with maybe at least standing for the Pledge of Allegiance or standing for the Star-Spangled Banner. So to Nebuchadnezzar, these three men were being inappropriately and needlessly inflammatory and disrespectful by their actions. So Nebuchadnezzar gave them a very blunt piece of his mind, and we read that starting in verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Now, this would have been the moment that these guys would have been like, just kidding, or whatever. A change of plans, change of thoughts. Okay, well, we'll give you homage that you deserve in this image, and, we'll follow through and do those things. But that is, of course, not what these men did. Continuing in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So Nebuchadnezzar basically asked them this very derisive question in verse 15. Who is the God who's going to deliver you out of my hands? Who's going to do it? That's what he was asking. And they responded in verse 17, well, our God is going to deliver us, and he will deliver us out of your hand. So the battle line had been drawn, if you will. That's what was happening in this dialogue. But then we have this sort of qualifier in verse 18, if you jump down there, where they're like, but if not, if God doesn't do whatever, and we have to ask, well, were these heroes of the Bible with this statement doing what we sometimes do? Was this their lack of faith that God would actually follow through coming out? Is that what they're saying here? They're kind of hedging their bets in the event that God does not deliver? Well, I don't think so. I don't think that's what they're doing here. And that is really the common scholarly interpretation, because the whole set of what is going on here, just the whole interchange and just their actions in general, read very much that they did expect that God was actually going to deliver them in a very real, right in the here and now kind of way. That is what they expected. So this qualifier in there of, but if he doesn't, probably was more for Nebuchadnezzar's benefit than for them. Almost like telling Nebuchadnezzar, well, even if God doesn't, you're still not right, essentially. Like that's more what that was in there for. Them being burned up is not somehow evidence against God. So, of course, in the furnace they went. Threw them right in there, which was so hot that, as we already heard, it killed the men who threw them into the furnace. Yet then just a short while later, Nebuchadnezzar saw them hanging out in the fire, understandably astonished to not only see 3 but 4 men in the fire. Now, we need to be careful when we read this to not make more of this particular scenario than what the Bible actually says. Because many of us have probably heard this story. We've heard somebody talk about this story, and somebody has been quite definitively said, well, the fourth person was Jesus. That was Jesus walking around in the fire, doing his thing, delivering these individuals. And much of this understanding actually comes from a mistranslation of verse 25 in the King James Bible. Now, it could be Jesus. It could definitely be Jesus that was in the fire, but it could have likely just been God in another form as well, or perhaps even an angel appearing on behalf of God. And we just don't know for sure, and Scripture by no means leans one way or another. There's no obvious indication that this was probably Jesus himself. Again, could be, but we don't know. But what we do know is that a miracle definitely occurred. A miracle occurred. God saved these three men in a miraculous way, and this deliverance was very apparent to Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 26. And as it was commanded to leave the stump, that is not the right chapter. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. So they came out. They were not harmed in any way. Everyone was astounded because it wasn't just Nebuchadnezzar there. It was all of his officials who were there too. They didn't even smell smoke on them. It was astounding, understandably. Then we read in verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. So Nebuchadnezzar was basically forced to answer his own question that he asked back in verse 15. Who's the God who's going to deliver you out of my hands? Well, he answered it right here. The God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is going to deliver them out of my hands. The conclusion that is drawn, and had to have been drawn by everybody there, is that God is a God who will deliver his people. God is a God who will deliver his people. Now, in a few weeks, we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 6, which is the story of Daniel and the lion's den, right? Another story of deliverance. A similar sort of predicament that we read about right here in chapter 3. Daniel, though, in this case, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, was put in a predicament where he was told to worship a false god, or he would face death. Yet with a similar resolve as these three to not sin regardless what the consequences were going to be, Daniel very openly continued to pray to the one true God and to God alone. And expectedly his act of insubordination, because again that's how it would have been seen, it resulted in him being thrown to the lions, just as these three men were thrown into the furnace. And with the lion's den, just like with here, the king wanted to know if the God of Daniel would deliver him from the lions, asking the same question. And when it was discovered that he did, God did deliver from the lions, the king made a similar proclamation to that of Nebuchadnezzar. God delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So just in this book, we have two kings representing two kingdoms, two superpowers in their day, who had to declare before the entire earth that the true God is a God who delivers his people. That is the declaration that they made, that he would deliver in a very real and even in an impossible way at times. They knew it. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew it. So why is it so hard for us to have this same kind of certainty when it comes to the deliverance of God? We know God can heal, but often we don't really expect him to heal. We know God can fix any situation, but we take control of the situation as if he won't. We know God's way is better, but we don't trust him enough to actually carry through and actually do it, that he would carry us through even if we did do it. And I believe that a big part of the problem is that we mostly think of God delivering in miraculous and supernatural sort of ways, just like these two stories in the book of Daniel. Or if not in the supernatural, amazing stuff like that, at least with the really big things or the unusual things that happen in life. So, maybe God delivers on mission trips and with house purchases when we're trying to figure that stuff out, or with marriages or really long road trips across the country. Maybe God delivers in those kinds of situations. But when was the last time you thanked God that you were able to safely travel the entire 15 minutes to work on a warm, sunny day? When was that? When was the last time you had a mild headache, you took a Tylenol, it went away, and you thanked God for relieving you of your discomfort? Or when was the last time that you took a drink of water out of the tap and you didn't die of dysentery, like an Oregon Trail? And you thanked God for that? For most of us, this stuff never enters our minds. We don't even think about these things, which means that for most of the time, in most of our routine, we don't credit God for delivering us from anything at all. We don't even think about God in any way. And in a society like we live in, where humans can reliably do a lot fairly easily, our cars are probably going to get us from point A to point B. Our power and our water are probably going to stay on. We will probably get the medical care that we need. We don't tend to credit God for delivering us unless things start to get difficult, or at least less reliable. If our perspective on whether or not Shaquille O'Neal was a reliable and good basketball player was based mostly on his ability to score half-court shots, like that was most of what our basis was, we probably wouldn't think he was very reliable as a basketball player, because he rarely ever took half-court shots, and even if he did, he probably didn't make them most of the time. And that's true even if he's a better half-court shooter than we are. Now, our faith in Shaq as a good basketball player should partially be based on how well he can make half-court shots, at least a little bit, but it should mostly be based on all the other things he does, all the other baskets and assists that he's involved with making. Now, making a half-court shot, might be spectacular. That's great. It's great when they go in, but it isn't half-court shots that are going to be carrying most of the points for most of the game towards winning an eventual victory. And although God obviously could make every half-court shot if he wanted to, he still doesn't make those shots very often. And sometimes he chooses to not make them or chooses to not take them at all. But our faith in God's reliability to deliver is going to be impacted if the only things we're going to consider are those amazing, unusual, spectacular things. And since most of us do tend to mainly rely on those things and try to understand and think about, how is God delivering? Is he reliable in doing these things? It's no wonder we lack the faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had. But like Shaq, God's game is about much more than just those amazing supernatural means of delivering us. Because our God delivers in both the miracles and in the mundane, in the routine. This is his true track record, And that's what our faith and trust in him should be based on, all of the ways that God delivers. Just look at the Lord's Prayer as an example. What was Jesus praying in this prayer? And we're not going to look at the whole prayer, but one part of the prayer in particular, Jesus said, you should pray like this. And it was, give us this day our daily bread. That was the prayer that we should pray. And he wasn't just saying this to, kind of go through the motions or, empty words to throw out there because, God didn't really need to deliver the daily bread. I mean, most, the Jews weren't starving where they were in that particular point in history. But Jesus still said, this is what you should pray. Praying for it as if this is something that God was actually going to do. What Jesus was saying is that something as simple as lunch is actually an answered prayer. That's really what this means. Now, my kids know that. Every time there are meatballs in the back, it's like, oh, blessings from God. My son even was, one Sunday, he had mentioned that one of his favorite parts of coming to church is the meatballs afterwards. So they realize the amazing thing of answered prayer just in a meal. But this is really the way that we should be thinking. And if each of our meals every day, we think about, all those meals, snack, a midnight run to the fridge, if we think about all those things as actually being answered prayer, if that's the reality that we recognize, that each one of those times is God delivering us from hunger, God meeting our needs, God satisfying our wants, if we do that, God can't remain unreliable to us. God can't remain a God who rarely ever intercedes because he'd be doing it all the time. We're recognizing that he's doing it all the time. In Psalm 55, starting in verse 16, it says, "But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me." You know how sometimes you're driving down the road, you're kind of on autopilot, you take a left turn, but then after you take the turn, you're like, whoa, I didn't even look. Fortunately, somebody wasn't there, they didn't hit me, and you just kind of breathe a sigh of relief. Well, that's not just dumb luck, that is God delivering you. God is delivering you. Every time you go to the doctor and you get a great health report, it's not just good exercise and good eating habits. Cancer, other diseases can hit anybody. I mean, roll the dice. A great health report is actually God delivering you. That's what it is. Every evening and morning and noontime, we should acknowledge that God has once again delivered us safely. Each moment of freedom, each moment of pleasure is God in his grace and mercy delivering us, consistently delivering us, reliably delivering us, as he did the day before that and the day before that. He's delivering us all the time. He really is. This is the reality. And when we start to acknowledge that that is the reality, our faith in God for who he is naturally just going to grow. God is a God that we should expect to deliver us because that's what he does. That's what he has been doing. That is his track record. God is a God who delivers his people. But not only does God deliver us from the sort of here and now stuff, the things that are going on in the world that are impacting us from the outside, he even delivers us from the evil within inside of us. And he delivers us in an eternal sense. Paul, when he was sort of lamenting how he just had no real control over his own sinful nature, his own tendencies towards sin, he said this in Romans. He said this in Romans 7, verse 24. If you can flip me on the right slide up there, please. Romans 7:24. "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" And then he answered his own question just a little bit later in the next several verses. Jesus is the one who will deliver. Jesus will deliver because when we follow Jesus, God frees us from sin and death, which of course is the ultimate means of deliverance if you think about it. Not only to be with God for all of eternity, but he's even going to deliver us from this draw that we have towards evil in our own lives so we can live our best life right now. Delivered from that pull of evil within us all. Every victory over sin is actually God delivering you. That's what it is. This is the God that Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego knew. This is who they knew. A God who had built them up with wisdom and knowledge and learning. A God who brought them into these positions of authority. A God who they knew they could reliably trust to deliver them, even if they didn't understand how or when or what it would look like. Not just because they knew that God was powerful, which of course they did, but more critically because this was the pattern that they saw that God did all the time. This was the track record of God delivering. And so when the moment came when they had to choose between obedience to God or remaining alive, those two choices, they already had the faith and trust in God that he would continue to deliver as he always had done. And this confidence that they had that God will deliver, if we embrace that as well, it can make all the difference in our own lives and relationship with God as well. So how can we go about doing that? How do we go about gaining confidence in God as a deliverer in these big and challenging and miraculous types of situations? How do we do that? Well, it goes back to making sure we are acknowledging God for what he's doing in the small and the mundane and the routine. Thanking him for another day. Thanking him that you woke up. Thanking him for another meal. Thanking him that you were able to safely cross the street. This is how we firmly establish in our minds that God has this track record of being our deliverer. It's how we establish it. So maybe you're here today, you're struggling with some sacrifices that you've been making. You acknowledge you've been making them. You know you probably shouldn't have made those things, sacrificed those areas. Maybe you're putting in extra hours at work because you got to make some extra money. Maybe you're participating and doing some stuff with your kids so they can do well in their sport, and you're doing those things in place of what you know you should be doing, maybe showing up on a Sunday to church, maybe doing some stuff, serving God in another way, but you're doing these things instead because you got to do it. How else is it going to get done? How can you have faith that if you change course and obey God, as you know you should be doing, that God is actually going to carry you through? Well, again, it starts by recognizing that God has faithfully carried you this far. Every day. So if you put him first in this as well, there's no reason to believe he's not going to continue to deliver you. Even in this, through your financial challenges, through your kids' sports and the time demands that are involved with that. Maybe you desperately want to be involved in a romantic relationship or get married. But nobody moves into marriage God's way anymore. Nobody does that. And you believe that if you try, no guy or girl is going to want to put up with it. How can you have faith to remain true to the one true God and not just let things slide? Have faith that God will still bring you a spouse at some point. Well, it starts by acknowledging that God has reliably delivered you to this point in your life. He's been faithful each and every day. He's got a good track record that's established in your mind. So if you continue in obedience, continue to make his ways your ways, he will deliver you through your relational challenges as well. Maybe you're struggling with the thought of death after this life. You find yourself clinging, holding on to things of this world. You're investing your treasure in the here and now, building your own kingdom. It's hard for you to focus and trust God with eternity. How can you have the trust in God that he has better things in store for all of us on the other side of death? Well, it starts by remembering all the care that God has given for us, for you, to this point in your life. All the good things that he has given you, all the ways he's provided and protected you to this point, day in and day out. God is regularly interceding. He has regularly interceded. And he's regularly provided. So you can trust that he will continue to provide for you in the future as well, even with the eternal future. God is not at all like that friend who won't commit. And when we think of him that way, it really shows how small we think of God. A God who only interacts with his creation on occasion, who only occasionally provides for our needs. But God has a good track record. It's a good track record, day in and day out, showing us that our God is a God who will deliver his people. Let's pray.